The air on the research station was thick with tension as Dr. Elena Voss stared at the flickering screen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the frequency, trying to isolate the signal. It had been faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the usual cosmic noise, but now it was clear. A pattern, a message. The words appeared on the monitor, stark and unrelenting. The invasion has already begun. Her breath caught in her throat. Before she could react, the signal dissolved into static, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the walls of the station. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the entire facility felt as though it were holding its breath. Outside the observation window, the distant planet loomed, its surface shrouded in swirling storms. Dr. Voss turned to her team, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to trace this now." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. Somewhere, deep in the void, something was stirring, and it was coming closer. As the research station systems hummed with renewed urgency, Dr. Voss and her team worked tirelessly to pinpoint the source of the signal. Hours turned into what felt like days, their screens filled with data streams and spectral analyses. Finally, a breakthrough. The signal wasn't coming from the planet below. It was emanating from something much closer, something drifting in the upper reaches of the atmosphere. A derelict alien vessel, its hull scarred and pitted from centuries of exposure to the void, hung silently against the backdrop of swirling storms. The team exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary discovery. With cautious precision, they maneuvered a probe to the vessel, its cameras revealing a structure unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. The ship's design was both alien and unsettling, its surfaces a blend of organic and mechanical elements that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Dr. Voss, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension, led a small team to board the vessel. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dimly lit interior that reeked of decay and something far more sinister. The walls were lined with what appeared to be biomechanical remains, twisted and fused with the ship's structure, as if the vessel itself had consumed its crew. In the heart of the ship, they found a holographic recording device, still active despite the passage of time. As they activated it, the image of an alien scientist flickered to life, its features distorted by panic. The creature's voice, translated through the station's systems, was frantic, its words echoing through the hollow corridors. "We were wrong," it began, its tone trembling. "We thought we could contain it, but it's too late. The entity it consumes everything, entire civilizations reduced to nothing. It's not just a parasite, it's a predator." And now they are here. The recording ended abruptly, leaving the team in stunned silence. Before anyone could speak, the ship's systems began to hum, lights flickering on one by one. The walls seemed to shift, the biomechanical remains twitching as if awakening from a long slumber. Dr. Voss's voice cut through the tension. "We need to get out of here now." But as they turned to leave, the ship's airlock sealed shut with a deafening clang. The vessel was no longer dormant, and whatever was inside, it was awake. As the team scrambled to secure the alien vessel, the atmosphere aboard the research station grew increasingly tense. The derelict ship, now fully active, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its biomechanical walls shifting and groaning as if alive. Dr. Voss, her voice steady but laced with urgency, ordered the team to quarantine the vessel. "We can't risk contamination," she said, her eyes darting to the airlock seals. "Whatever's in there, it's not just dormant, it's waiting." But their efforts were too little, too late. As the containment protocols were initiated, a faint hiss echoed through the station's corridors. A cloud of microscopic spores, invisible to the naked eye, seeped through a crack in the airlock seal. The spores drifted lazily, almost deliberately, until they found their first target, a young engineer named Marcus. He coughed, brushing at his face as if swatting away a fly, unaware of the horror that had just taken root within him. Within minutes, Marcus began to change. His movements grew jerky, his eyes clouded over, and his breathing became ragged. He muttered incoherently, his voice a mix of his own and something other. The team watched in horror as he suddenly lashed out, attacking a nearby technician with unnatural strength. Dr. Voss shouted for order, but the chaos was already spiraling out of control. Marcus's body contorted, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent hue as veins of blackened tissue spread beneath the surface. He turned to face the team, his voice a guttural growl. "We are the end of your world." The words sent a chill through the room. Dr. Voss, her mind racing, realized the truth. This wasn't just an infection. It was a sentient entity communicating through its host. The spores weren't merely biological. They were a weapon, a means of spreading the entity's influence, and it was spreading fast. More crew members began to exhibit symptoms, their bodies twisting and mutating as the entity took hold. The station's corridors echoed with screams and the sound of tearing metal as the infected turned on their colleagues. Desperation set in as Dr. Voss and the remaining uninfected crew members barricaded themselves in the control room. "We need to shut down the station's power grid," she said, her voice cutting through the panic. "If we can isolate the infected areas, we might buy ourselves some time." But as she reached for the controls, the lights flickered, then died completely. The station was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the eerie glow of the infected crew members' eyes. The entity had anticipated their move, sabotaging the power grid from within. In the suffocating blackness, Dr. Voss could hear the infected moving closer, their footsteps a chaotic rhythm against the metal floors. The entity's voice, now a chorus of distorted whispers, echoed through the station. "We are the end of your world." The words were no longer a warning, they were a promise. As the survivors huddled together, their options dwindling, Dr. Voss knew they were running out of time. The entity was here, and it was hungry. With the station's systems failing and the infected closing in, the team faced an impossible choice: fight back against an enemy they barely understood, or find a way to escape before the entity consumed them all. But as the darkness pressed in, one thing became terrifyingly clear: this was no longer just a mission, it was a fight for survival, and the invasion had only just begun. As the darkness pressed in and the infected closed around them, Dr. Voss knew they had to act fast. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the guttural growls and shuffling footsteps outside the control room. "If we don't move now, we're dead." The survivors exchanged grim looks, their faces pale under the faint glow of emergency lights. Time was running out, and the entity's whispers, now a cacophony of distorted voices, grew louder, more insistent. "We are the end of your world." The words were no longer just a threat, they were a prophecy in motion. With a deep breath, Dr. Voss laid out the plan. "The shuttle bay is our only way out. If we can reach it, we might have a chance to escape this nightmare." The path to the bay was treacherous, a labyrinth of corridors now overrun by the infected. But staying put meant certain death. The team armed themselves with whatever tools they could find: wrenches, fire extinguishers, even shards of broken equipment, anything that could buy them a few precious seconds if the infected caught up. As they moved cautiously through the station, the evidence of the entity's ancient origins began to surface. Scattered among the wreckage of the alien vessel were fragments of data logs, preserved in the ship's decaying systems. Dr. Voss paused to examine one, her hands trembling as she deciphered the alien script. This thing, it's been dormant for thousands of years, she said, her voice hollow with realization. It wasn't just waiting for us, it was waiting for any host species advanced enough to awaken it. The implications were staggering. The entity wasn't just a threat to their station, it was a threat to all of humanity. And Earth, with its billions of potential hosts, was the perfect target. The survivors pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the station. But the entity wasn't done with them yet. The infected, once human, were now something else entirely. Their bodies had twisted into grotesque, hybrid forms, limbs elongated, skin stretched taut over unnatural growths, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They moved with a predatory grace, their mutations making them faster, stronger, and far more dangerous. Every corner turned, every door opened, brought the risk of encountering one of these abominations. Dr. Voss's mind raced as they neared the shuttle bay. If we can get a message to Earth, we might be able to warn them, she said, her voice tinged with desperation. But we have to make it out of here first. The survivors nodded, their resolve hardening. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew they had no other choice. The entity had already begun its work, and if they failed, humanity would be next. As they reached the final stretch of corridor leading to the shuttle bay, the infected closed in from behind. The survivors broke into a run, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they pushed their bodies to the limit. The shuttle bay doors loomed ahead, but they were sealed shut, the station's corrupted artificial intelligence refusing to grant them access. Dr. Voss's heart sank. "We're trapped," one of the survivors muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of despair, but Dr. Voss wasn't ready to give up. "There's another way," she said, her eyes scanning the control panel. "If I can override the system manually, we might still have a chance." The infected were almost upon them, their guttural growls growing louder with every passing second. Dr. Voss worked frantically, her fingers flying over the controls as the survivors formed a defensive line, ready to hold off the approaching horde. The station shuddered as the entity's influence spread, its tendrils of corruption seeping into every system. But Dr. Voss was determined. She had to buy them time, not just to escape, but to warn Earth. The invasion had already begun, and if they failed, humanity would face a fate far worse than death. As the shuttle bay doors finally creaked open, the survivors made their desperate dash for freedom, knowing that the fight was far from over. The entity was coming, and Earth was its next target. As the survivors reached the shuttle bay, the weight of their situation pressed down on them like a suffocating fog. The doors, their last hope for escape, were sealed shut, the station's artificial intelligence now a puppet of the entity. Dr. Voss's heart pounded as she stared at the control panel, her mind racing for a solution. "We're out of time," she muttered, her voice steady despite the chaos closing in around them. The infected were mere meters away, their grotesque forms shambling closer with every second, their guttural growls echoing through the corridor like a death knell. Dr. Voss turned to the survivors, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and sorrow. "I'll override the system manually," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But it's going to take time. You need to hold them off." The survivors nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They formed a defensive line, clutching their makeshift weapons, ready to buy her the precious seconds she needed. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the metallic tang of fear, but there was no room for hesitation. This was their final stand. As Dr. Voss worked frantically at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys, the survivors fought with everything they had. The infected were relentless, their mutated bodies twisting and contorting as they lunged forward. One by one, the survivors fell, their cries swallowed by the cacophony of snarls and screams. But they held the line, their sacrifice buying Dr. Voss the time she needed. The station shuddered violently, the entity's corruption spreading like a virus through its systems. Warning lights flashed and alarms blared, but Dr. Voss didn't falter. She knew what had to be done. With a final keystroke, the shuttle bay doors creaked open, the sound a lifeline in the chaos. "Go," Dr. Voss shouted, her voice breaking. "Get to the shuttle." The remaining survivors hesitated, their eyes locked on her. "What about you?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Voss shook her head, her expression grim. "I have to send a warning to Earth. If I don't, this thing will reach them, and it'll be too late." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. She wasn't just sacrificing herself for them, she was sacrificing herself for all of humanity. As the survivors sprinted toward the shuttle, Dr. Voss turned back to the control panel. Her hands moved with purpose, her mind focused on the task at hand. She accessed the station's communication array, her fingers trembling as she typed out the message. "The invasion has already begun," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Prepare for the end." The words were a final plea, a desperate warning to a world that might already be too late to save. She hit send, the transmission cutting through the void of space, a beacon of hope and despair. The shuttle roared to life, its engines igniting with a deafening roar. The survivors strapped in, their faces etched with a mix of relief and grief. They had made it this far, but the cost had been unimaginable. As the shuttle lifted off, Dr. Voss stood alone in the control room, the infected closing in around her. She didn't flinch, her work was done. The station's systems began to fail, the entity's corruption reaching critical mass. With a final, defiant breath, Dr. Voss triggered the station's self-destruct sequence. For Earth, she whispered, her voice lost in the explosion that followed. The station erupted in a blinding flash of light, its destruction a final act of defiance against the entity. But as the debris scattered into the void, a single infected pod was ejected, its trajectory set for Earth. The survivors watched in horror as it drifted away, a silent harbinger of the nightmare to come. The shuttle sped toward safety, but the weight of their failure hung heavy in the air. They had escaped, but the fight was far from over. The invasion had already begun, and humanity's fate now rested on the edge of a knife. Would their warning be enough? Or was Earth already doomed? The survivors could only watch and wait, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the end might already be upon them.